everybody, welcome to the next installment of my video on listing every Genesis song in ascending order of quality based on some uncertain mix of objective and subjective factors. This video is going to cover numbers 139 to 130. If you haven't already seen the videos for the songs up to this, it's worth going back and checking them out. I'll try to link to a playlist. I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We're a modern art rock project which involves a pretty fair amount of influence from Genesis in terms of writing, arrangement, technique. Check us out on Bandcamp or wherever you stream your music. So in my review for the song Small Talk, I mentioned the initial positive response that a lot of people had to the album Calling All Stations. And if you put this particular song on late at night, in the right frame of mind, you know, maybe a little bit tipsy, in a generally good mood, I think you can really still hear whatever kind of excitement and promise a lot of people heard in this album back in the day. That opening riff has surprising bite. You know, the drums have a nice kind of heavy, solid pounding quality. Ray is singing his ass off. The whole thing has a lot of lift and power. The lyric is about a guy getting lost and freezing to death. So, you know, it has that kind of narrative quality that the old school stuff did. It's a reasonably dark topic, but it's something that really there aren't a lot of songs about. There are elements here which feel identifiably Genesis, particularly in the keyboard sound, but at the same time, there are also elements that feel new to this incarnation and really appropriate for what was going on in popular rock music in the mid-90s. Listening to it now, the first couple minutes still feel enveloping and moving and transporting and exciting. But there's a synth solo that happens about 2 minutes, 53 seconds in, where the cracks start to show. That synth solo, it's just kind of a collection of effects. It feels like a placeholder where you would eventually put a more effective solo and just generally a better constructed instrumental break. And then the material after that really doesn't do anything particularly different, and the whole song fades out while in the middle of kind of edging half-heartedly toward a crescendo. So there's a sense here that they've found something really potentially resonant and transcendent, but then at the same time, without either a third songwriting voice to add more ideas or without a little bit more drive and focus, they're not carrying those out to their full possibility. In that regard, I think that this makes a pretty good microcosm of the strengths and frustrations of that album. And it's a notable song for that reason, and still reasonably effective to listen to, even if it's not an all-timer. So this song has a simple but driving, really effective piano riff. It's got an interesting lyric with some really creative, cool details. It's got a pretty catchy chorus. It has hardly any strings, and the backing vocals mostly stay out of the way. In all those regards, it's a very solid first album cut without really too much else to say about it. So among other things, and then there were three, is notable, I think, is the last album where the band really avoided making vulnerable emotional statements, with the one notable exception, of course, of the last song, which is really kind of a watershed in that regard. And I think that this song is it's an example of where they were starting to encounter diminishing returns with the fantasy approach, and maybe an argument that it was perhaps time to move on from that, as effective as it had been for a lot of their earlier stuff. Instrumentally, the melodies here, the arrangements, the playing are impressive, but maybe a less effective version of many of the other things that are happening on this album. It's probably also a sign that if Phil Collins was going to be a writer, his strengths would not lie in this vein. So Jonathan King claims that he imposed songwriting discipline on the cuts from this album to the extent of really insisting that they work in a 3-minute verse-chorus kind of model. This is one of the few places where they were allowed to move outside of that. They go for a little bit more of an advanced structure here with a pause and then a slowdown into a really big kind of climactic coda section with some really good electric leads by the standard of the time and some very cathartic singing. And that little extra bit of structure and pacing beyond the norm makes this feel a little bit more progressive and definitely makes it a standout track on the first album. This song is interesting because it really feels like a band playing live and tight in the studio, even though it comes from right in the period when they were shifting away from that toward a lot more of a focus on sound crafting. That's especially true in the case of the drums. You know, this is a song where the drum performance is live and tight and dynamic in a way that was being phased out from most of the studio work on this album. However, it feels like it's about 3 revisions away from being an actual song. It's all performance with minimal writing, which is classically B-side-like in that regard. This is a brief, kind of minimal coda to the first album. Tries to evoke the transcendence that accompanies the feeling of new love, and I think actually does a good job of kind of putting that feeling into an emotional context that kind of becomes divine or spiritual, mystical even. It's a really nice little song, and I think it does a great job of escaping a lot of the sonic and conceptual dross, which drags down some of the weaker half of the first album. One thing about Genesis is that a lot of their poppiest, catchiest stuff actually has interesting little bits of musical trickery going on that might go above a lot of listeners' heads. This is not one of those songs. This is, even by the standards of their pop hits, a pretty straightforward, likable but dopey kind of song. It's not half as good as most of their big hits. This is a mildly affecting love song, which is probably a couple times more beloved than it really deserves. The vocal melody is actually surprisingly intricate when you listen to it. That falsetto in the verse is a nice bit of performance detail that I know was a bear to pull off live. Points off, though, for the repetitive chorus and just for kind of an overall dynamic flatness. So there are 2 moments in this song that almost elevate the whole thing. One of those is that ominous kind of synthesizer drone that swells over the whole course of every last line. And the other is the kind of smallness and nakedness and vulnerability of the way that Phil sings the particular line, "Take the danger out of a naked flame, and what have you got?" And those little details of arrangement and performance can really do a lot. You know, they can elevate a good song into great. But in this case, what they're doing more is taking a song that doesn't necessarily have too much of a melody or riff, and where the lyric is interesting but a little nonsensical, and somehow actually elevating that into being a lot more haunting and affecting than it maybe necessarily has any right to be. On the other hand, I don't know what the hell's up with that snare sound. Points here for the use of effects in creating a hazy, shimmering quality. The bass pedal also does a really nice job of adding some heft to what would otherwise be a very, very wispy sound. But the underlying writing is just way less developed, way less intricate than pretty much everything else they were doing in this period. The in soundscape is a very intriguing part here. It's a shame that it gets cut on most of the reissued versions of this song.